welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm really glad to be with you here. And I just want to say a quick thanks to Dadasha and Jeannie for doing their magic of helping everything work out to bring Professor Zoe Todd here today and to make the event run and create the poster and all of those good things. So thank you. So I just wanted to think about in doing a land acknowledgement today, just to remind everyone that I am here on these unceded lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And in relation to this, I want to think about the importance of the work of our honored speaker today, Professor Zoe Todd, who I'll introduce in a moment. And just to think how Professor Todd is working to think about varied Indigenous forms of governance and legal systems that were developed on these lands that we now call Canada, and that continue to operate in varied ways throughout the lands. And so this is just an important part of this broader picture of Indigenous resurgence, Indigenous living, and something that doesn't nearly get as much attention to as I think as it should. There's more talk about just land as land and not about how these systems that are sophisticated and developed over a long time of governance and legal systems have come into play. So in terms of today's event, there's what we're going to do is you can ask your questions through the Q&A. You can ask them at any time throughout the talk, but I'll be waiting to open them at the end. And just to note that I think you probably saw it on your screen, but this event is being recorded, and then it will be available in the coming weeks on our departmental websites. And when it is available, we will send you an email. And you also probably saw that closed captioning is available. And so you should be able to enable it. If you look at your bottom right corner, there should be a live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. So that's helpful. So here we are. We're so pleased to have Professor Zoe Todd with us today. I've been following their work for a long time. Currently, Zoe Todd is an associate professor of sociology at Carleton University, and their research is on fish, colonialism, and legal governance relations between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. And they have researched human-fish relations in the Nunavut settlement region and on Arctic food security. We actually had a wonderful master's student who was doing some work on Arctic food security recently. So that would be interesting to be in conversation with that. Their current work focuses on the relationship between people and fish in the context of colonialism, of environmental change, and resource extraction in Treaty 6 territory, which includes Edmonton and Emiskwacy, Waskahikan, Alberta, and the Lake Winnipeg watershed more broadly. And I just also want to say they published widely in many different ways and have been so active on social media. So go out and check out their work. Very provocative and insightful posts that I always learn a lot. Their work employs a critical Indigenous feminist lens to examine the shared relationships between people and their environments and legal orders in Canada. And this is towards understanding how to bring fish and the more than human into conversations about Indigenous self-determination, peoplehood, and governance. And I would like to point out that while Zoe Todd's work is focused on what we now call Canada, it is of great interest for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples everywhere, especially those who are interested in understanding their potential relationships with and obligations towards, which is often a thing that doesn't get talked about too much, towards other living beings, and breaking away from a utilitarian mode of turning these other living beings into resources for human needs and profits. And I'll just quickly say that I found Zoe Todd's notion of how Indigenous folks might be working to bend and disperse state laws around fish to be fascinating, into how colonial systems are not just resisted, but dealt with through many forms of creativity, which is something I've been really trying to pay attention to and notice myself. And Zoe's work really helps me to think about that better and understand that more. and that their work is a powerful reminder that Indigenous philosophies and legal orders continue to live and thrive and animate people's relationships, duties, and obligations to place even in urban contexts. It also expands the more typical notions of society that are usually discussed as a human-only space to embrace how fish and other living beings are also part of larger social worlds and how they are part of ongoing colonization and what decolonization might mean. So that's my introduction for Professor Todd, and I will leave it to her to take over from here. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael and Jeannie and Dasha for just being really lovely hosts. And it's really exciting to get to come into a space. SFU has so many wonderful scholars and students and staff. And so I just feel really excited to get to speak here today. So I'll just do my formal kind of like land acknowledgement in Nehiawean. So Tanse, Zoe Nitsigasun, Nia Odepem Suasqueo, Egwamaga Snanaas Qualicum, Niwigan, Ginanas Gomitinoao, Marci Kakiao, Niwako Makinak. And just before I begin, I just want to acknowledge how so many of us are still carrying the weight of the pandemic with us, and the opportunity to gather in these spaces and still think together and co-create together is so powerful given all of the heaviness. And so I just, before beginning, want to kind of like enable an opportunity for us to come into this space in the best way that we possibly can and kind of just like share ideas as thoughtfully as possible. And I hope that what I talk about today can be seen as, a little bit playful. Like what I will be sharing is a little bit critical, but I offer it in sort of a playful spirit that, is informed by wonderful, brilliant people and teachers and colleagues that I've been thinking with and alongside for quite a while. So I'm going to start the timer because I have a tendency to ramble if I go off script, and I have a script too. So excellent. And I'm going to share my slide. So I'll just share my slides here. Perfect. So today I'm going to talk about fish, and my colleagues and I work with fish because they give us so many opportunities to think with them about how different aspects of the living world come together at the interface between land and water, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worlds, and across vast stretches of time and place. And so I also draw in this talk on my years of working and living in unceded Algonquin territories in Ottawa, which are governed through Algonquin law that ties deeply to fish and water. It is in unceded Algonquin territories where I've seen up close some of the sort of, disjunctures between what settler organizations and institutions claim to be doing and what they are in fact actually doing, both within Indigenous lands and across Indigenous watersheds. So the work that I share here is shaped by learning from my Métis dad, pictured here, Gary Todd, a fabulous Métis artist, my non-Indigenous stepdad, the late Wayne Roberts, who was a really thoughtful and sort of fearless biologist, freshwater fish. He also worked with amphibians and also herpetology. He was a great fan of all critters across Alberta and worked very hard to protect them alongside other incredible trailblazing naturalists and biologists in the province. And then I also think with my incredible mom, Cheryl Croucher, who is a very accomplished environmental and science journalist in Alberta. This talk is also shaped by the critical Indigenous fish philosophy and legal governance work that I learned during my PhD by spending time on the land and waters with amazing fishers and knowledge keepers in Paulatuk in the Northwest Territories, including Andy and Millie Thrasher and their family. This talk is dedicated to my friend Patrick Thrasher, who is a brilliant fisher, hunter, traveler, and knowledge keeper who has shared his passion for fishing and land protection with me over the last decade. This talk also comes from a place of listening for years to the fish and waters in my homelands in central Alberta, where Indigenous sovereignty is not always fully respected by provincial or federal parties. And finally, I draw from learning to see what is happening below the surface of the water at the site of fishy refraction between the air and water interface, where things might not always be as they first appear to our human eyes. So this talk brings together a critical Indigenous studies lens to freshwater fish conservation issues in Western Canada, explicitly bringing critical Indigenous scholars into conversation with decolonial and decolonizing scholarship from the US and throughout the global South to examine what I am calling the integrative turn in Western sciences, which is emphasizing, efforts to try and do things like braid knowledge within colonial disciplines and institutions. I try to gently advance a call for a critical Indigenous environmental conservation studies approach that examines the gulf between what settler institutions claim they are doing and what they actually do at the water's edge. And I propose that fishy refraction and listening to fish are two ways that we can attune to the underlying, sometimes obscured logics of elimination and possession, drawing on Patrick Wolf and Aileen Morton Robinson, that drive current settler calls for reconciliation in environmental contexts in Canada today. So with all that preamble, we're going to start with a fish story. So we're actually going to go to the bull trout first. So let me start with a fish story. Indigenous trout species like bull trout have lived in Alberta's waterways for 13,000 years, since the last glaciation of the lands Alberta now claims. In that time, they have weathered incredibly dynamic and shifting conditions, and diverse Indigenous peoples have come to know, story, and relate to these fish since time immemorial. However, species like bull trout, species like bull trout have barely survived the last 116 years of intensive settler colonization of Alberta's lands and waters. Bull trout, West Slope cutthroat trout, and Athabasca rainbow trout are some of the hardest hit fish species in the province, impacted by intersecting pressures in Alberta's eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And I'll just go back to this map. So on the very left-hand side of this map is the Rocky Mountains, the eastern slopes, and those are the headwaters for the North Saskatchewan River, the Red Deer River, the Bow, which are incredibly important waterways for Alberta, but also, as you can see, they tie into very vital watersheds across Saskatchewan and Manitoba and drain into the Lake Winnipeg, and then eventually make their way to the Hudson's Bay. So, so these are some of the hardest hit fish species in the province, impacted by intersecting pressures in Alberta's eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, pictured here, including mining, logging, unregulated recreational vehicle use, ATV use, climate change, urban development, and agriculture. All three species are now listed under the Species at Risk Act as either endangered or threatened, and recovery for all three is frankly looking grim. Despite the odds being stacked against them, however, Indigenous trout species in Alberta managed to capture the imagination of a politically polarized province in the most unexpected ways earlier this year. So in May 2020, in the midst of the first wave of the pandemic, the Alberta government quietly rescinded the 1976 coal development policy, which protects sensitive headwaters and watersheds in the eastern slopes from coal mining and exploration. And this was established after extensive consultation by the Lougheed government in the 70s with Albertans, and Albertans, spoke so vociferously against industrial incursions into this landscape. And so for the current Alberta government to just quietly rescind it on a Friday in May during the pandemic, and like I used to work in comms, and you don't want people to know something, you put it out at Friday at the end of the day. So the news of this 2020 rescission of the coal development policy flew under the radar for many months as Albertans battled the SARS-CoV-2 crisis. The government of Alberta had been working quietly with Australian coal mining firms for several years, and the province's decision to remove protections for sensitive fish-bearing streams in the Rockies was speculated to be at the behest of these multinational firms. Things came to a head in January 2020, however, just ahead of a major intervenor case in one of these projects, which is the Grassy Mountain coal mine. And these issues came to a head for the public in January 2021 when renowned country singer Corb Lund of Hurt and Albertan fame spoke out about these issues. He is a rancher as well as a renowned musician, and so he spoke out about problems with potential selenium pollution and other threats from the proposed Grassy Mountain metallurgical coal mine and other proposed mines in Southwest Alberta. Learning that sensitive headwaters and ecosystems were at risk, Albertans began rallying for the coal development policy to be re-implemented. In the flurry of Facebook posts, tweets, Instagram posts, and community outcries that followed, often rallying around the hashtag Save Our Mountains, there was, sorry, I lost my place. So around this hashtag of Save Our Mountains, Albertans of all political stripes rallied behind an unlikely cause, which is the world-class trout fishing, trout habitat, and sensitive waterways that metallurgical coal exploration, mining, and concomitant selenium pollution threatened. So this is just a snapshot here on the left of Corb's Instagram video that went viral. It was then picked up by the CBC and other outlets, and Corb kind of became one of the spokespeople of this movement. So following Corb Lund's interviews with media outlets, his meetings with government officials, international country music star Paul Brandt posted a picture of himself fly fishing for trout in the eastern slopes and stated his unequivocal support for protecting the region. Other country music stars soon joined in, including Terry Clark, Katie Lang, and others. While trout were not the only concern that people rallied around regarding exploration in the region, the fish and the water allowed a polarized Alberta to unite at the proverbial water's edge to imagine better futures together. A crucial facet to the public outcry was that those speaking out against the mining turned to the advocacy of Indigenous land and water defenders, including the Niitsitapi water protectors who have been working for years to protect the region and assert their sovereignty in their homelands. For the very first time in my lifetime, many settler Albertans were listening closely to Indigenous peoples and supporting the assertion of First Nations governance and sovereignty to help protect critical headwaters, lands, aquatic species, and ecosystems against political, economic, and ecological threats in Southwest Alberta. In early February 2021, the provincial government was forced to reinstate the coal development policy and its protections and commit to a revisiting of how to govern coal development in the area. The federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change subsequently denied permits for the Grassy Mountain mine in August 2021, following successful intervenor efforts by First Nations advocates, local ranchers, and other allies in court. In a sense, people were listening to the fish and advocating for them in whatever way that they could. And for once, the fish and their waterways won for a brief and shining moment. The question is, how do we make sure that this momentum continues? So we'll come back to these prairie trout in a bit, but first we have some other fish stories to think with. So fish who have been on the planet for 510 million odd years have so much to teach us about how to survive and thrive on a planet in constant flux. Much of my work is deeply influenced by Indigenous legal scholars and scientists who built space for my generation to join the Academy. And today I will open this talk with a quote from one such trailblazer, Kainai scholar, leader, and philosopher, Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who spoke about fish in a talk that he gave in Calgary in 2016. And so we'll just go back to that quote. So Western science, he stated, Western science is largely aimed at exploration. Native science is aimed at sustainability. We exist in a very narrow gap, as we've mentioned. And the fish, for instance, nobody's talked about the fish in this Congress, not that I know of, but the fish has been around, think about it, way before the dinosaurs, before the Neanderthals, way before our time. The fish is still around. I wonder what scientific formula the fish has discovered. We should ask the fish. They've survived. So this talk is an effort to try and think about what one of these scientific discoveries that the fish have enacted could be. The first thing that arises when I share this quote with non-Indigenous parties is I'm asked the question, how do we ask the fish what they've discovered? I stumbled for a very long time trying to come up with answers to this for non-Indigenous audiences who may not be attuned to the work of listening beyond what are largely sort of two-dimensional planar or one-note metrics of empirical data, human dominion over the environment, and Cartesian ideas that persist of objective human observation of a static natural world that humans exist outside of. Fortunately, we're in a moment where that's being challenged. So I think we have a little bit more hope in figuring out how to listen to the fish across, colonial contexts. It's in working with my dear friend and collaborator, Dr. Amar Kangiser, who is a geographer and sound artist who works in the Pacific, that I realized that those well-meaning settler audience members have been asking the wrong question. Asking the fish what they have discovered is not necessarily about talking. In fact, I now realize it's about how we listen to them. And it is in listening to fish and the ways that they communicate to us, including through their withdrawal from unsuitable or damaged habitats over the course of the last several hundred years of colonial violence across vast Indigenous homelands, or their fishy return when habitats are restored and repaired. It is through this kind of embodied listening to fish that we learn how to mobilize the appropriate environmental governance ethics required to honor the fish as scientists in their own right. So every Indigenous nation in Canada has a deep and storied relationship to fish that informs local laws, science, stories, language, art, and existence. Fish are integral to Indigenous life in Canada, but fish communities across the country in both marine and freshwater habitats are in trouble. Although Indigenous knowledges were dismissed for centuries as so-called primitive or savage by racist Western academia, and you can turn to the work of critical Indigenous scholars Eileen Morton Robinson, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, Vine Deloria Jr., Kim Talbert, Jessica Kolepanuck, among others, who have studied the devastating impacts of these racist characterizations of Indigenous knowledge upon Indigenous peoples and Indigenous sovereignty. But in spite of this racist scientific history, today as Western scientists grapple with the realities of the global climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction event that might wipe out up to 75% of species on Earth, Western science and scientists are now pretty belatedly turning to non-Western Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems for answers about how to come into better relationships with the planet and with non-human beings like fish. As a result, there's a growing body of peer-reviewed scientific work being published in the Western canon that demonstrates that Indigenous managed lands and waters are the most effective paradigms through which to protect species biodiversity. I'm just going to take a juice break to get my sugars back up. I'm sorry. So this work affirms long practiced Indigenous philosophies, legal orders, and worldviews that center reciprocal responsibilities, obligations, and protocols between humans and non-human beings, including plants, animals, and what Brenda McDougall calls kinscapes for collective survival. In the work that I get to do with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peers who work in Canada, Australia, and Borneo, my colleagues and I critically engage this recent colonial academic and regulatory interest in Indigenous environmental knowledges by arguing that first, Indigenous governance and law, i.e. the active ways that knowledge is mobilized in a society, and second, Indigenous sovereignty, which are the plural forms of autonomy that enable us to mobilize integral relationships within the context of our dynamic and distinct philosophies, cosmologies, and geographies, so both law and sovereignty, are why Indigenous peoples are able to protect so many diverse ecosystems and homelands in the face of ongoing social and political threats. In other words, it is not just about knowledge and reconciliation as abstract liberal ideas, but also about the active ways that knowledge is mobilized in Indigenous societies through ceremonies, protocols, laws, stories, and relationships that are living, constantly reaffirmed through ongoing relationships within and between communities, both human and non-human, and practiced in a rooted, immersive way by Indigenous peoples within our diverse, distinct homelands. What my team and I are learning, building on our collective decades of experience in environmental conservation work, is that Indigenous autonomy, sovereignty, and laws are key to protecting fish and waters here in Canada and globally. And this is nothing new. I'm not saying anything new here. There is so much brilliant Indigenous work on the role of Indigenous law and sovereignty in protecting the environment. So many Indigenous legal orders around the world recognize fish, other animals, lands, waters, and ecosystems as more than human beings who are sentient, thinking, and operate autonomously from humans. On the other hand, historical Western and scientific colonial management approaches tended to treat animals and plants as inert or non-sentient beings, which fostered perceptions that colonial humans had dominion over animals, the environment, and also over Black and Indigenous peoples who were once categorized in deeply racist ways as non-human or not fully human in racist Euro-Western societies. These colonial conservation ethics were built on traditions of white supremacy, imperialism, extraction, capitalism, and control, and actively coincided with efforts to eliminate Indigenous peoples entirely from countries like Canada, the USA, Australia, and elsewhere. What I am learning from working with Indigenous knowledge keepers in watersheds across Canada and internationally is that when Indigenous peoples and communities are honored and supported to be strong, autonomous, and healthy, the fish are also strong, autonomous, and healthy, and vice versa. There's such a great need for platforms, programs, and approaches that truly support Indigenous communities to tell our own stories about fish, watersheds, and Indigenous governance in our own words and on our own terms. So building on my time working in Ottawa and in settler political environments, I want to make a very gentle intervention for settlers coming into Indigenous legal and scientific spaces right now. There's a growing popularity in environmental conservation spaces in Canada in recent years by settler governments, academics, environmental NGOs, and others to adopt partnership, integration, or reconciliation approaches to environmental conservation issues. And these approaches, while laudable, attempt to remedy historical injustices of Indigenous land theft and erasure in environmental policy through what Glenn Coulthard or Elizabeth Pavanelli would call the politics of recognition. And this is work that builds very much on the seminal work of Frantz Fanon, which is to say these reconciliation or integrative approaches as they exist right now in a Canada that is a genocidal colonial state. These integrative approaches to wildlife and environmental conservation in Canada tend to locate the problem of Indigenous erasure and dismissal of Indigenous environmental knowledges in the problem of a lack of inclusion of Indigenous peoples and worldviews in colonial institutions such as universities, governments, and regulatory bodies. These integrative approaches, as I call them, and I'm not here to critique them entirely. I think that they have a really important role. I'm here to look at the underlying structural things that make it hard to do that work. So these integrative approaches attempt to repair colonial harm by including Indigenous peoples in existing colonial management, conservation, and environmental governance systems that are slightly altered to make space for Indigenous perspectives. And that slightly altered aspect, that's not from Indigenous people, that's from the state that is just never going to concede power unless we really, really find a way to do it. So I call this approach the planar or binomial approach to colonial redress. These well-meaning approaches genuinely believe that we can weave solutions from the flattened universalist cloth laid down by white supremacists, colonial capitalists, imperial systems over the last 600 years. However, such integrative approaches, when kind of contending with the messy violence of the colonial state, they truly reach the outer limits of the universalist paradigm, which is a singular imaginary world held together by the suturing of stolen continents to one another through contemporary supply chains, and the violence of capital, which Cedric Robinson, Christina Wright, Sylvia Winter, and others have shown us, like the history of capital is anti-Blackness. So this is shaped by the histories of the Middle Passage, the genocide of distinct Indigenous nations, and the subsuming of plural worlds and cosmologies into what I wrote very I wrote here, one pulsing angry sphere of extraction and possession, which has been described so clearly by Sylvia Winter, Anibal Quijano, and many others. So this is where it is so important to turn to the work of South American Indigenous thinkers and non-Indigenous South American scholars who study their work, who articulate and mobilize the pluriversal and the pluriverse, the concept of many worlds coexisting and multiple ontologies coexisting. And this work is in response to the violence of the colonial white supremacist universal. And these scholars and thinkers remind us to disrupt the urge of Western sciences, disciplines, and institutions to continually refold us back into that homogenous set of categories and classifications that facilitate extraction of and from our lands, waters, knowledges, and lives. Eduardo Cohn argues that this work demands a kind of cosmic diplomacy across plural existences, and many brilliant scholars have written about how to navigate ethically and accountably across plural ontologies, including Vanessa Watts, Sarah Hunt, Kim Tallbear, Juanita Sundberg, Arturo Escobar, Marisol de la Cadena, Achille Mbembe, and so many others. And Paul Nadasdy invites us to think about these relationships in terms of Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries. And I also find it helpful to think with Leroy Littlebear, who invites us to think of these relations in terms of quantum physics and flux. And I like to contrast an Indigenous quantum approach with the settler grasp of our knowledges, which is perhaps more like Newtonian or classical mechanics. And so Western science, is sort of still at the stage of not being able to account for light being both a particle and wave. It's still fixated on those very planar, singular or even just binomial relationships. So Indigenous peoples are working in the context of quantum mechanics, plural worlds, multiple realms folding back in on each other. And you can think of this like the time knife from The Good Place. This is sort of where Indigenous nations and societies broadly are coming from, while settler universalism and academe is still parsing the world in a very planar, simplistic set of heuristics. And so that Paul Nadasdy would think of this as the Euclidean geometries, very, very sort of like, I am not a mathematician, but, like squares and, right angles and not that like incredible, like not the curves and much more complex geometries that we get beyond that. So this is what we are being folded back into when settler institutions do not truly honor or grasp what Indigenous sovereignty means. And this is why there are limits to integrating Indigenous knowledges in Western science within current dominant paradigms. And so I've tried to illustrate this for us with a set of paintings. And so the first painting is a watercolor I did of a landscape. And when I put it in PowerPoint said, "Would you like me to remove the background?" And I said, "Sure." And then it did this. And I was like, that is perfect. This is a perfect sort of illustration of like Exhibit A, what settler universalism thinks Indigenous knowledge is. And it's like, you get some of it. I want to give credit. Like people are genuinely trying, and I'm not here to pick on individual people. I'm here to, help us to hold institutions and frameworks and structures accountable. So this is sort of like what I would say within the context I work in Alberta. This is, I think, what settlers kind of can grasp of Indigenous knowledges. So then the second image, this is the full image that I had put in before we took the background out. and so this is just my abstract, landscape inspired by, it was in August, praying for rain actually, because we were in a very, very challenging drought where I am this summer. And so this is what I would say, like, this is Indigenous ontologies, knowledge, law, this is kind of like my effort to capture that kind of the interrelation of everything. And you get a broader sense of what's going on within the environment. And then brace yourself for number 3. This is Indigenous sovereignty. So this is when you put all of those knowledge, those stories, those philosophies and laws into the context of our plural cosmologies. And that's when you get this like like it's visceral, it's complicated, and every Indigenous society is operating within our own distinct sovereignties and cosmologies, and they just have this, the cosmos is brought into that. And I don't know how else to explain it other than to use these paintings that I made this summer, but I hope that this gives a little bit of a visual to understand what I'm talking about. So rather than that kind of planar, saying that like, well, we can just meet across our, sort of binomial differences and we'll weave from there. No, there's so much more going on. And I'm not the first to say this at all. Like, obviously there's this entire ontological turn that tried to reckon with it. My little intervention into that was to ask non-Indigenous folks to cite Indigenous people as theorists in our own right. But I still think the ontological turn had a lot of important things to offer. And that's become so clear as leading scientists suddenly say, wow, Indigenous knowledge exists. And it's like, yes, it does. And it is tied to laws and governance and sovereignty. And so you can't just, with all due respect to folks who are trying to braid knowledge, yes, but you have to like braid in the time knife way, like it's not just going to happen within the universal. There's like a lot of expansion and dismantling of the universal because it's a false universe. There is no universe. It's the multiverse, it's the pluriverse. So I hope this is making sense because we're going to dive into that sovereignty now and think with fish. So turning back to the integrative conservation approaches being proposed and advanced in Canada right now, such as braiding knowledge, two-eyed seeing, partnership, and reconciliation paradigms, which I all think are commendable frameworks. But when they're mobilized within existing colonial systems, these integrative approaches struggle to navigate the underlying structural, ontological, existential violences that countries like Canada are founded on. Settlers must address these underlying structural realities, as uncomfortable as that may be, before assuming that we have the tools to start enacting Leroy Littlebear's quantum, allyship, and repair. I'm just gonna have a little bit more juice. As the late Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe argued, settler colonialism, which shapes Canadian society, is built explicitly on the deliberate elimination of Indigenous peoples through genocide and the subsequent replacement of Indigenous peoples by the settler colonizer and settler institutions. Further, Indigenous scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, drawing on her time living in Australia, in colonial Australia, argues that settler systems are driven at their core by an ontological drive to own and control and possess Indigenous worlds, peoples, lands, livelihoods, and ontologies. And so this is a quote that I've pulled where she sort of articulates that, actually the concept of indigeneity is invented as a white possessive tool that enabled colonizers to sort of erase our distinct kinship networks, our distinct laws, cosmologies, and relations, and replace us with this homogenous category that they applied as a pseudo race category, but also folded in other complex ways of categorizing us. And I'll get to that in a moment with a quote from with a reference to Anibal Quijano as well. So what I've learned from my years navigating colonial academe, policy worlds, and the environmental NGO and nonprofit world is that key to dismantling colonial logics of possession is learning to discern between what is said by a colonial party and what is meant in the emotional and psychosocial landscapes of settler colonial spaces. They don't always align. And in order to do this, we must learn how to listen, really listen to what is going on across the interface between a settler universal ontology built on elimination and the white possessive, and in contrast, plural dynamic Indigenous cosmologies and worlds, this. So just as Leroy Littlebear urges us to ask the fish what scientific formula they have discovered over their 500 million years on the planet, which I contend is possible by learning to listen to the fish in embodied ways, we also need settlers to learn to listen to and feel what Indigenous sovereignty looks like and feels like. So I don't know what this picture feels like to you, but to me, it just feels like expansive, mind altering. It's an embodied feeling of like severing myself from the structures that were used to dispossess my Indigenous ancestors on my dad's side of the family. And in that, of course, are fish, because my ancestors lived along the North Saskatchewan River for multiple generations. And so for me, it feels expansive. I don't know what it feels like for other people, but for me, it's an expansion. It's an embodied feeling. But it took a lot to be able to get there, because colonial structures are so intent on possessing us. And also through that kind of separation of thought and place, as Vanessa Watts explains to us, it tries to cut you off from that feeling. We're just supposed to be thinking kind of brains in jars, thinking things, but not necessarily relating to our environment. So there's lots of really powerful work that helps us get to this relationship. So Indigenous sovereignty, it can't just look like the anthropological capture of an imagined form of pan-Indigenous tradition that conveniently upholds the white possessive, as Eileen Morton Robinson, Audra Simpson, and others demonstrate. To truly confront what plural Indigenous sovereignties feel like within the dynamic context of Indigenous life across myriad homelands. And I'm thinking here with Teresa McCarthy's fantastic work on regressive authenticity in settler understandings of Haudenosaunee governance, and also Audra Simpson's critiques of anthropological erasure of Native sovereignty. We really need that sense of feeling. And in the context of a state that still asserts the doctrine of discovery as the basis of its legal authority, we must push back against universal Western science and law and their drive to enclose, capture, and apprehend Indigenous knowledge and life, after Audra's work as well. And we need to question whether those processes of capture and enclosure are really the natural partners for our environmental repair work, especially when there are plural, non-Western, non-dominant worlds beyond the settler universal for us to work with, including legal governance and deliberative work with other displaced and dispossessed peoples forced out of their homelands through the machinations of empire, extraction, genocide, white supremacy, and colonial capitalism. Drawing on Fanon's concept of provincializing Europe, or turning our back on Europe and inventing a new history of man, it is important that in asserting Indigenous sovereignty here in Canada, we do not inadvertently reify or legitimate Euro-colonial theft of lands, waters, and atmospheres, or its other registers of capture and injustice. Instead, we can fold European science and law into the realm of many knowledges, negotiating our futures with respect for plural sovereign existences that build respectfully from our mutual obligations to lands, waters, atmospheres, and existence. From the perspective of freshwater fish protection and repair work, I'm therefore far more interested in learning what Métis law, alongside Cree law, Inuit law, Mi'kmaq law, Algonquin law, and the laws and cosmologies of plural African diasporic societies, Caribbean societies, and communities of peoples who live in our homelands for refuge today. Then I am interested in legitimizing the legal and scientific fictions through which Canada mobilizes British common law, French civil law, and white possessive science to deny the inherent sovereignty of the nations they have stolen lands and resources from. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some northern fish. In my doctoral work, which was almost a decade ago that I was doing this field work, I learned from Inuvialuit knowledge keepers about how Inuvialuit relationships to fish and Inuvialuit law are key to shifting colonial conservation paradigms in northwestern Canada. By reasserting local governance rooted in deep histories and local sciences developed since Ingorani a very long time ago, the community of Paulatuk in the Northwest Territories has managed to successfully repair colonial harm to the local Hornaday River char population in only a few decades. And it's so inspiring as an Albertan, as someone, a Métis person from Alberta, watching our fish species decline across the province. What people are doing in Paulatuk is so inspiring, and it's through the assertion of law. So crucially, I learned about how the community refracts and disrupts colonial efforts to control and possess lands, waters, and laws by working to creatively bend and disperse settler logics across human-fish relations as micro sites of engagement. And I draw that idea of sites of engagement from Arctic anthropologist Anne Fina Reardon. In other words, local sovereignty is enacted in dynamic ways, even within colonial regimes, and enables local obligations to fish well-being to be fully enacted. I call this Indigenous bending and dispersion of settler possession through relationships to fish, fishy refraction. And so this is just sort of showing you, scientifically speaking, this is one of the scientific formula the fish have figured out. Light travels at different speeds depending on which medium it is in. And so it travels faster in less dense media like air and slows down in water, which causes it to bend when it hits the water. And so when you're standing on the edge of the lake, or you're in a boat, or the edge of the river, and you look down, you might see a fish. And this concept for me came to me in 2009. Like, it started in 2009 when my friend Herbert Nakamayak and Andy and Millie Thrasher and others took me fishing at Billy Lake in Paulatak, outside Paulatak. And I'm from Alberta, where our lakes are fairly algae heavy to begin with, but also have been fairly heavily impacted by industry and agriculture and other factors. So you don't see fish the way you see fish in Paulatak. And I just remember sitting in this boat, and this giant lake trout just sort of like swam up to us, checked us out, and swam away. And that fish like just opened my mind when I realized like that this engagement between very skilled fishermen in Paulatak and fish is just such this like intimate sort of set of relations across like choosing when to kind of engage autonomously. And so a fish in the water is not where the fish appears to be. And so that fish wasn't where exactly it looked like because of the refraction. But a good fisher person knows how to calculate that. And a fish also knows how to calculate that across the water-air interface. And I think of this as a good metaphor for understanding how we engage across settler colonial paradigms and plural Indigenous ones, because we are not engaging in exactly the same media. We are refracting constantly. And Chris Anderson talks about this in his book, on Métis, and lots of other people have thought this. I'm not the first person to think of it, but the fishy part that really comes from that lake trout in Billy Lake. So when Indigenous legal governance systems are centered in freshwater fish conservation, and local peoples have greater control over resource and conservation activities in our homelands, both humans and fish benefit. With all of this in mind, it is clear that we need an explicitly critical decolonizing approach to studying Indigenous governance and freshwater fish conservation, an approach that is rooted in material concrete changes to the structures through which Indigenous lands were taken by colonial governments and resource extractive industries. And in our work, our team reminds regulators and policymakers that there is no one-size-fits-all Indigenous science or laws. And in fact, as the late Peruvian social scientist Aníbal Quijano reminded us 20 years ago, the erasure of distinct Indigenous societies and nations in Africa and in the Americas, and the folding of distinct societies into racial categories, was a key mode through which colonial power was extended over sovereign and autonomous peoples across continents. The erasure of distinct Indigenous nations and societies into a racial category of Indigenous subsumes distinct Indigenous cosmologies and attempts to fold us back into that planar, binomial, flat land of the Western colonial white supremacist universal. So in our work, we remind settler interlocutors that there are multiple Indigenous sciences and legal orders informed by each nation's specific relations, stories, and histories with and in place across many continents. Which is to say, we call upon our Western peers to make sure they are not erasing local stories, knowledge, and laws with popular pan-Indigenous concepts that are applied by colonial actors and applied from elsewhere without first listening very closely to local stories and local needs. So turning back to the fish that I opened this talk with, the fish that I was talking about, the native trout in Alberta that are in trouble. These are the native trout species in Alberta that captured the imagination of the disparate and polarized Alberta publics in the face of intensive extractive pressures in the Rocky Mountains earlier this year. What does it look like, though, to listen to these fish across plural ontologies, cosmologies, and worlds without doing that folding and trying to fold that experience into the possessive and eliminatory logics of Western law and science? Listening in ways that help settlers involved in fights to protect the eastern slopes from trying to braid sovereign peoples whose homelands encompass the Rocky Mountains across vast scales of time into the planar or binomial alliance of colonial and Indigenous knowledge. So what does a quantum pluriversal listening look like in this context? This is the first time I've put this in a talk, so we'll see how it goes. So listening to fish. So this is the second fishy scientific formula that we're exploring today. And listening to fish is an embodied affair. Western science believes that fish were the first vertebrates who learned to listen and hear on the planet. And critically, hearing in fish is both an auditory process involving their ears and otoliths. So they do have ear systems. They have a system with otoliths and that allows them to kind of like measure changes in pressure. Some fish species, this also involves the swim bladder, and it's very amazing and intricate. And so this is not so entirely different from us with our auditory hearing systems. But one very cool thing about fish is that they also listen through their bodies through the lateral line. And so I found this incredible shot of a bull trout, and just look at that beautiful lateral line. and I will just say that I captured that in my bull trout. There's the lateral line as well, just to, because I just want to make sure I'm scientifically accurate when I draw the fish. And so they listen through the lateral line, and the lateral line essentially extends the sensory organs through the body so that fish can sense changes in pressure in the water around them. And it accomplishes this through these cilia, and there's these canals, and it's just this incredibly intricate system. And just sort of imagining that coming down your body. And you can imagine hearing with your whole body. Like, I think it just so fascinating and also overwhelming. But the lateral line essentially extends the sensory organs through the body so that fish can sense changes in pressure in the water around them, meaning that they are gathering and interpreting data from their immersive 3D environment at all times. And this is exactly what allows schools of fish to coordinate their behavior so effectively. So that lateral knowledge that they're gathering allows them also to measure and respond to what other fish are doing. And it allows them to almost move as one when needed. And you've probably seen those incredible, like, Planet Earth videos of just like schools of fish in the ocean swimming like that. And, how do they do that? Well, it's this lateral line plays a role in it. So from their work on listening and attunement and climates of listening, Dr. Amar Khangiser teaches us that listening requires discernment, and it involves the entire body. And it is about learning what consent feels like, what no feels like, what boundaries feel like in our environment. And for settlers like Amar, it is about respecting what is not for outsiders to know or possess within Indigenous homelands. So Amar is a sound artist working, they grew up in Australia in stolen Indigenous lands. They currently live in Melbourne, but they have worked very closely with poets and environmental activists in Fiji, Nauru, and Papua New Guinea. And so they think very deeply about listening and climates of listening in the context of communities throughout the Pacific who are being very heavily impacted by climate change. And so, and Amar's work really is about asking, like, what can a settler ethically do in sovereign Indigenous lands? And so there's a history of kind of environmental sound recording that has just sort of taken it as like a colonial right to go in and just record glaciers, take sound samples from places. And Amar is trying to say, no, you have to bring that back into Indigenous sovereignty and respect for the autonomy of non-human beings as well. And it's not just for us to just take. And so Amar sort of is trying to teach settlers to learn what it feels like when the environment says, yes, you have permission to do this. And their work isn't about adopting Indigenous stories into non-Indigenous contexts. Amar says, like, that's not for us, it's not for them to know as a settler, but just that concept of respect and consent is where they're trying to start. They're starting at the planar world to bring settlers up into that quantum world. So it is this fishy listening with the body, the use of the lateral line, that is perhaps the most instructive lesson from the fish for those of us trying to discern which settler spaces are truly safe for us to build partnerships within on the one hand, and those which are merely keeping up appearances on the other, and keeping up appearances to maintain control of lands, resources, and capital on the other hand, keeping up appearances. And this listening and attunement, learning to trust the information our bodies are communicating to us from our environment, information that goes very far beyond the visual flourishes of colonial spaces. This is a kind of listening that is so crucial in enabling us to navigate between the flatness of Western universalism and the quantum dynamic nature of our plural Indigenous knowledge systems. So I've learned you can't rely on one sense alone. We need everything. It has to be embodied. So in his 1966 essay, A Report from Occupied Territory, James Baldwin details ongoing anti-Black violence enacted by the police against community members in Harlem in the 1960s, violence that extends back to the very formation of the settler colonizer United States of America. And this is violence that shapes Canada and is instructive in the formation of the entire planet altered by the invocation of white supremacist, colonial capitalist, Christian imperialist man and science, as Sylvia Wynter teaches us. In this essay, Baldwin writes in the concluding paragraph that, quote, "One is in the impossible position of being unable to believe a word one's countrymen say. I can't believe what you say," the song goes, "because I see what you do," end quote. I want to be explicit that the context I write in as a Métis person from the prairies is very different from what Baldwin is describing in Harlem in the 1960s. I do not want to misappropriate the visceral experiences of state terrorism that Baldwin describes, which is employed by the white colonial imperialist police to incarcerate, possess, violate, and control Black communities in New York City and cities across the continent then and now. However, the invocation of belief, of listening, of looking past the words employed by white supremacist institutions and actors is palpable and instructive for analyzing the frameworks being asserted by colonial actors in Canada today towards Indigenous communities and other communities united across geographies of white supremacist dispossession and displacement. When one listens in closely and feels into the underlying logics of these liberal frameworks, espousing a desire to reconcile, to integrate knowledges, these lofty promises couched in new language while occupying the same stolen lands and controlling the same tightly held treasuries, it is not hard to discern whether they are still built on the same possessive, eliminatory logics that dispossess, displace, and marginalize Black and Indigenous peoples and communities across myriad watersheds, lands, and communities. You can feel when something has integrity, and this is what I'm trying to teach my students. You can feel it. Someone could be telling you the most beautiful discourse, and like Trudeau is the picture of this, beautiful words, such like disappointing action. And we have to learn to trust that gut feeling when we say no, this isn't the right place for this. Perhaps we can build our solidarity with other dispossessed people. Perhaps our labor, our short time on this planet is best spent elsewhere. So I hope it is this lesson that you can take away from this talk. The need to cut through the outer layers, the appearances of colonial claims and colonial articles, conferences, workshops, and policy briefs, and to use all of our senses, our embodied ways of knowing, to relearn how to trust our gut, our ears, the receptors in our skin, the chemical receptors throughout our bodies, and as Leroy Little Bear might also argue, spirit, to discern whether what is being said to us by colonial parties in fact lines up with the political and social commitments of our nations and communities. So in the settler colonial nation state, you have to learn quickly, as Baldwin details, to discern between what is said and what is meant by colonial actors, because your very survival depends on it. I gently contend that in the context of Indigenous sovereignty, it is important for us to hold settler institutions to account for their propensity to modulate their viral and/or cancerous intentions in new protein coats and new language to try to evade detection by the immune systems of our communities. In so doing, in learning both how to listen to the fish, but also learning to listen like the fish, we have the potential to reorient our partnerships, collaborations, and commitments towards those that truly honor our reciprocal obligations to fish communities and to plural human communities displaced and dispossessed by colonial logics of elimination and possession. Ginanis Kamatin, thank you for listening. So I'll just end. This is the work I do, and here's just some more this is the future I'm trying to work towards, this kind of, I don't know, just this relationality to environment and a kind of integration of thought that really honors these plural experiences and knowledges. And thank you for sitting through that. I was very nervous in the beginning and I kept stumbling over my words, but I pulled it together. And I'm really honored you sat through this, and just thank you for holding space. And I hope there were things from this that you can take and refract and use in your own work, so that we can just uphold those collective solidarities and sovereignties towards the highest purpose and good. So thank you.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much, Zoe, for that talk. I mean, I feel like that too, it embodies part of what I see as your kind of as this gentle and not so gentle critic of kind of what's going on and what kind of interesting things that people are doing, and a way to kind of push forward the good things. So not just kind of doing those easy dismissals at all of kind of what happens carte blanche, but that's just part of your thing. So thanks so much. And let me just say that for the audience there, I see a lot of people clapping and very happy with your challenging and fascinating talk. And just a reminder that if you have any questions for the speaker, there's the Q&A box down below. You'll see that little button at the right of your screen, and just remember to keep your questions brief and your language respectful. And I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can, but I can't guarantee that I can get to all of them. So wow, let me just start off with, you covered so much ground, and and it's really a lot of like fascinating to like metaphors as to ways to think through this. And I love your use of the artwork too. And I found that hilarious, that this idea that like the program actually could take away the background.
Yeah.
as though these things could be kind of separated in those ways. And one thing I just saw in those two was just in my own kind of feeling about the artwork, was this kind of like layering and movement of energies of things between kind of things that may be seen as like separate layers, but some kind of movement within those. And that I think that like one of those aspects that I think you push it so much is to try to suggest to this wider audience what those sovereignties might look like, feel like, work. And I just was curious, like what other inspirations do you find in terms of written work, in terms of artwork, in terms of creative practice, in terms of like trying to better understand and experience different like kind of plural forms of Indigenous sovereignties? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, so I'm so indebted to Andy and Millie Thrasher and their family for taking me out on the land and getting to experience a space that is cared for so autonomously. And so like the Inuvialuit settlement region, the Inuvialuit settled a land claim with the federal government in the 1980s and 1984, and implemented a whole host of sort of governance mechanisms that enable very powerful forms of care for the land and for more than human beings. And growing up in Alberta, where in some cases, like people working within the provincial government aren't even supposed to reference treaty, like that, so I want to make clear, Alberta is so different from BC and so different from the Northwest Territories, where, Alberta does not anywhere near approach an understanding of sovereignty yet. I can feel it in BC, like yes, the sovereignty of Indigenous nations here, while not fully respected by the province. I'm not, I'm sure that many very brilliant people would say don't get too ahead of yourself. But there's a way you can feel it here in a way that in Ottawa, where Algonquin sovereignty is not fully recognized. Like the parliament is on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin land. There is no treaty for that land. And institutions across the city really don't get Algonquin sovereignty. Like they're like, well, we have this committee of Indigenous people we picked. And it's like, well, yes, but do they speak with authority from the Algonquin nation?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so anyway, so BC and NWT are two places where I feel it better. And I think, so I guess like a lot of the inspiration comes from that just once in a lifetime opportunity as a Métis person to be able to work with brilliant knowledge keepers in the space where they are just enacting their laws every day. And to get to see that as an Indigenous person who has grown up in the prairie provinces where, only a few generations before I was born, Métis had been in armed resistance against the state. And that was what triggered, that alongside with Cree leaders who also participated in 1885, that was what triggered the harsh imposition of like Indian agents and the pass system, and so just getting to be in places like BC and the Northwest Territories where Indigenous sovereignty is being recognized and leading the way for the rest of the country, that is a lot of what sort of like inspires me as a Métis person to try and bring that, you kind of like really bring that to the fore in Alberta, in Ottawa, because settlers there have just become so comfortable with the white possessive and the elimination, and are so comfortable speaking over and for Indigenous peoples, and then telling us that's reconciliation. It's like, you don't even know the first thing about this, and so yes, and so I just think that that I'm so lucky as someone from the prairies. But also there are very powerful forms of sovereignty enacted on the prairies, and I don't want to erase that. Like, again, the Métis rose up against the state. Like, that's within our, within our history. We said enough is enough, and we took up arms against the state. And, and I think lurking in the back of the mind of the settler kind of prairie governance is just this like they were formed in the crucible of that, and they're still so palpably scared of assertions of Indigenous sovereignty, and we have to disrupt that. And so part of what my work with my brilliant friends and colleagues is that fish allow us this opportunity to talk about those things without directly confronting them. And in Alberta, where the province has launched multi-million-dollar inquiries into so-called environmental interference and environmental NGO interference in the oil industry, or has a $30 million energy war room that targets environmental activists, fish are a way for us to talk about those things in different ways. And so fish, that was why I was so struck by like Paul Brandt, who I think he's quite friendly to the current government, but Paul Brandt was willing to say, I stand with the fish, right? And it's these, you have to, in a polarized environment like Alberta, where many different sort of factions of colonial sort of players have deliberately interfered in our governance and sort of create those divisions for their own ends, to find a way to unite Albertans. And I've never seen Albertans united the way they were against the removal of the coal policy. Like, it was just mind-blowing. I lived through the Klein austerity years. My stepfather was let go from the university because of austerity measures in 2010. And so like, anyways, sorry, I could just like, and I think that the broader like central Canadian media often erases a lot of that nuance in Alberta, and it plays into, like, Jason Kenney's not from Alberta, and he plays up on these offensive stereotypes about us. Yes, Alberta is racist, but the resistance within the province is much more palpable than people outside of Alberta realize, I think. And to see settlers, like for the first time in my life, really listening to Indigenous land protectors and water protectors in Alberta, it was incredible. And so, I don't want to overstate this because it's still early days, but I just have so much hope. And the conversations we're having kind of like one-on-one with people, people really want to do the right thing. Core Blend, Paul Brandt, Terry Clark, they just released a new version of Corb's This Is My Prairie. We have to kind of tackle their This Is My Prairie and save our mountains, because like there isn't still a possessive there.
We are, yes.
Yeah. And part of what we're doing is we're like when the pandemic is over, like our goal is to gather people and center Indigenous sovereignty in those conversations, and just do that quietly and gently, and bring people together so that they can talk about what's, I want my goal, but we have a broad team and everybody has their own important goals. But like my goal is if I could just help settlers feel what Indigenous sovereignty feels like, and just to like feel what it feels like to be outside of the colonial paradigm. I feel like that can get us a long way. And that's just my dream. So that's why I work with fish.
That is really fascinating too, like the way that fish become a means to open up all these realms. I mean, and I was kind of surprised that it wasn't just like a country music, white country music singer thing, or like trout have been associated with like the elite in England or other forms of possession. And what I found so fascinating in your talk too is like how they did connect with these, Indigenous land and water defenders who had probably been doing this work for centuries, really, about this. And so how that even happened is kind of a little bit like a surprising twist for me that I didn't expect.
It's like, it's really cool. Like I have not felt hope in so long. And then in January, I was like, what? This is so exciting. I was listening to country playlists. I was like, all right, Paul Brandt, you're back on the list. And like, so and I think really, Alberta is such a complicated place, but like my dad's Cree and Métis ancestors have these long, deep ancestral roots there. And like, I just feel those waterways, I just like, they're so powerful, and we need to work collaboratively to protect them, but it has to be within Indigenous sovereignty, and we have to honor the different nations that make up so-called Alberta. And anyways, I could ramble forever, but I just thank you for giving a space for me to share this work, and like also the work all my co-collaborators are doing, because I work with the most incredible people, I'm so lucky and I'm so thankful. So
Actually, we have a few questions.
Okay, sorry.
I've got a quick actually thing on your collaboration, which I didn't know you were being part of. And you said you're working here and then in Australia and Borneo. And I'm curious, like just to hear a little bit about that, but also how has like diving deeper, especially into the more kind of analogous place like Australia, another kind of British settler colony based on kind of some similar logics, has it helped you to like rethink what's going on here? Has it helped you to like kind of reframe your understanding of what is Canada and what is that scene? And then I also have no idea really kind of what your engagement is with Borneo, and I'd love to hear a little bit.
Yeah, so my work currently in Australia is through my connection to Amar Kangisar, but also my dear friend and colleague, Andrea Rollick, who is collaborating with the Gunai Karnai Land Corporation, and they want to develop a project looking at healing sea country. And my connection to Borneo is through my brilliant friend and colleague, June Rubis, who's a Bidea scholar from Sarawak. And June is working with Bidea community collective cooperative, and they are working on sort of protecting local waterways. And then Amar's work is, as I said, with poets and land defenders and climate activists throughout the Pacific. And it's just kind of incredible learning how distinct but interrelated a lot of environmental repair work is across different, and like I kind of intellectually understood this from reading. And there's so many Indigenous activists here who are doing international work, who have long, like George Manuel and the Fourth World, and long important histories of international collaboration. But it's really heartening to get to connect with different different experiences, and our goal through our Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures is to sort of make it a space that we want to eventually one day be autonomous enough that we have the financial capacity to sort of say, a community says like, this is a project we want to do. We say like, here's the money. You don't need to report back to us because you know what you're doing. And like to kind of, we want to help remove some of those. I know it's ironic to say like, we want to be another institution, but like, I want to use the reach I have to like gather and liberate that settler money. And the dream is to just sort of, step back and ensure that communities have the resources that they need. And so like my friend Joanna Radin, who works at Yale, she says her job is to liberate the ill-gotten funds of these settler universities. And I really have taken that to heart. And anytime I can get my hand on some settler university money, like just getting it to the people who are already working on the ground and removing a lot of those like barriers, like unnecessary reporting, unnecessary, like even time slips, like a lot of that stuff is so unnecessary. Like you're telling me someone's worked on this for 40 years and they need to like declare themselves a vendor. Like, what is this? And so that's our dream, is to sort of move away from that institutional kind of capture and just sort of be able to support these kind of projects. And so if you know any philanthropists, I don't know how to do that philanthropist sort of work, but and multiple communities have approached us and new communities are coming into our network all the time. And so it's just like also that ability for, like fishers in Alberta to learn about, strategies people are using in other places. Like that's also our dream. So that people can just like share knowledge and anyway, so that's how that's shaping up for us.
That's amazing. I can't wait to hear more. Let me get to some of the audience questions here. So, one of them, who is anonymous, said, thank you so much for your work, but to go to the heart of land back, what do you do about the undoing of property ownership in the way that Ronaldo Walcott describes, when so much property law and rights depends on systems established in BC for over 125 years? Catherine Gordon describes the history of land surveying, for example, something that laid the foundation for the violence of settler land possession. How to undo? What would the fish say?
Oh yeah, this is a very good question. And so I can't speak to BC. My Coast Salish relatives would be very offended but or might be offended. I don't want to put words in other people's mouths, but out of respect for the sovereignty of the nations here, I won't speak for BC, but I say for the Métis, like, I think we are still in a process of untangling ourselves from some underlying logics within our governance. And so for me, I'm so grateful to people like David Perrant and Cheryl Troop, Brenda McDougall, Chris Anderson, like all these brilliant Métis scholars. What we're trying to figure out collectively, and I would never say I speak for the Métis, I am a Métis person who works. But I think that sense of understanding of relationships to land and sovereignty that are not. So as I have a brilliant student that I've worked with, Alaka Ilauk, and she reminds us, that, from her perspective, like Inuit law is not a rights-based law, it's a responsibility-based law. And so if we're thinking about like collective relationships to specific lands, I guess it's just doing whatever we can to stay away from those notions of enclosure while recognizing autonomy. Those are complicated negotiations to make. But I do think a lot of it has to do with undoing the primacy of British common law, French civil law, upon which these forms of capture have happened in Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, elsewhere. So I don't have a very good answer to that, other than I think that if we can think a bit more expansively about what it means to be in good relation, but also like really understanding our obligations to lands, but also to other Indigenous nations like the Métis. We exist because we are in the relation to Cree, Anishinaabe, Dene, and also Dakota and Lakota nations who either recognized us or held us accountable for our presence in their lands. And so that's something I hope that can kind of come across through Métis work, is like, we exist because we were held to be good. We had to be held accountable as relations
Mm.
other nations. And so maybe there's something in there for us to think about, like how do you come into that without reinscribing these violences?
Mm.
I don't have a full answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And even just to like reminding us about this whole and very recent notion of like in British law or in other European, like a rights-based law and
Yeah.
what other forms might be, like a responsibility law. Or I spent some time in Hawaii and just hearing about kuleana, about like your responsibility to place was a very fascinating thing that was like embodied so differently by different people in different situations. But that whole idea of responsibility was very new to me and very important.
Yeah. And when I say sovereignty, I don't mean Westphalian sovereignty. I think that Indigenous languages and cosmologies
Yeah.
refract concepts. So sovereignty is a placeholder, but it's bending and dispersing. Yeah.
So and that's such a big thing to try to unlearn or to imagine otherwise.
Yeah.
Here's another question. So it's hello, Wopila, for this gift of a talk, Dr. Todd. I noticed in some of the paintings you shared that there's some long horizontal lines that resemble the sensory midlines that fishes have, which you talked about. Can you talk more about this and about developing your visual representations of sovereignty?
That's such a good question. And it's such an honor to not meet you in person yet, but I am a fan of your work, Kelly. So yeah, I think I hadn't thought of that before, but in Alberta, we live in the prairies on, an ancient seabed. And so those kind of like long, horizontal, sweeping kind of sort of landscapes, those are kind of locked into my brain. So I think that probably, they're coming from a place probably of imagining kind of those open spaces, but I hadn't thought of them as the midline. But now looking at them, I'm like looking at them right now. Yeah. And like they do cut across the same way they do in my fish drawings. So, and I think that there is something there about the spine of the earth and that kind of feeling of like these different spaces of engagement in the land that anyways, horizontality for me is a really big prairie person. And in Ottawa, when I walked into the Museum of Nature for the first time, like 2016, and it was hard for me to live in Ottawa. It's a hard place to live, the settler concept of Ottawa. And I walked into the old, I don't know if they still have it, but they have those old school dioramas. And when you come through the hall, there's two bison that are stuffed and they've painted this winter. So I think it was painted in like the 1910s or the 1920s, like really early, but they painted this perfect, like February winter prairie landscape. And I just felt my body like well up with gratitude. Cause like, I can remember my dad taking us on these long walks outside of Edmonton in that kind of exact landscape and that feeling of just the expansiveness. And I can, and Leroy Little, I'm not Blackfoot, so I won't try to approximate, but like Leroy Little Bear talks about some of those landscapes in his work and like listening in those landscapes. And I think if you've experienced them, and I think a lot of people in the plains have, like there's something about it that's just so compelling. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but the vertical, like that lateralness it makes sense to me. I don't know how else to, but anyways, thank you for a really generous question and pointing out something powerful in my work that I hadn't seen.
Love that. Right. It's like what we were talking about earlier before the talk about like sonic representations of sovereignty or other forms, things like that. Like what's this whole realm, because we're used to a certain form of like intellectual discourse around it, but like what are the things?
Feel like.
And I think we have time for one last question here. Okay. This audience member says, such a powerful, nuanced, multi-sensory experience. Huge thanks to you. I wonder if you might speak to the central role of salmonid species like bull trout at the heart of white settler recreation and tourism, and the complexity of those sorts of relations with, alongside, up against the sorts of fish relations you're talking about in the context of Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, I think like there's kind of like there's the concept of the charismatic megafauna, and like so settlers really respond to like polar bears and grizzly bears, you know, like there's just like an awe of them, as we should feel awed of these amazing creatures. But I think there's kind of like a charismatic mega salmonid maybe kind of going on too, where salmonids really capture people's imagination. So I think there was one I skipped over there of like a tiny little sculpin. I love sculpins. Wayne worked on preparing like recovery strategy information or for certain sculpins in Alberta, and you know, and so I think like Paul Brandt went on to do like a fly fishing documentary that he released earlier this spring, and like I think something about trout and salmonids, like do capture people's imagination. I guess maybe part of the complexity is that we have to make sure that they don't feel that ownership over them. And one of the problems with recovery of bull trout in Alberta is that like settlers literally did not think to reach out to Indigenous nations to develop the strategies like really for decades. It's really only in the recent, like maybe very recent last decade that it started to dawn on them that they actually needed Indigenous input. And they still don't do it in that sovereign way. And that's, you know, Palatec was able to turn around the decline of another like of Arctic char, Scalovulus alpinus, within 30 years because it was done within Indigenous law. But in Alberta, it took 38 years for us to get to a point where they were formally recognized by COSEWIC, and then DFO and Parks Canada formally listed them under the Species at Risk Act. And so I guess, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think that there's something there around possession, and that's what we're trying to disrupt as well. It's like, these are not your fish. And even my late stepfather, who was a visionary, you know, it is so devastating to me that he passed away 3 years ago, because we were just bringing him into the work of connecting with Indigenous knowledge keepers. And like, if he had been able to do that in 1983 when he first raised the alarm of bull trout, where could we be? So anyways, it's a really good question. So thank you to everyone for coming. Like, just thank you for spending time speaking with the fish. And I hope that this information is helpful.
Wow. Well, I loved it. I know the audience really loved it. Thank you so much for spending all this time. And I know it's a lot of work, and to hear about your collaboration, all these other projects. So I've got a million more questions I typed up. I'll get in touch with you later, but
okay.
And thanks to everyone for coming. The event was recorded, as you saw, and we'll get things up on the department website in the next few weeks. And then we will send everybody that registered a link to the talk. So I know I'll be asking some friends that weren't able to make it today I'll be sharing the link with them, and
awesome
ongoing discussion. So, yeah, okay, great. So,
thank you so much, everyone. Have a beautiful, gentle day.
Buddy.
Okay, bye.